welcome Drivyan, Captain Drivyan, and with a very, very astounding career. And I would say very less because I would really want Milind to talk about him. And thank you so much for gracing our VEI summit and agreeing to be a part of our summit and being a speaker over here. Thank you so much. Welcome, welcome. Namaste.
Thanks.
And yes, over to Arpita to introduce Milind and Milind to take over the session and have a good talk show with EI and armed forces being the topic. Stay tuned, all of you.
Thank you, Annapurna. Hey, welcome all once again to this wonderful talk show, EI and the armed forces. I'm sure over the last 1.5 days, somewhere we might not have touched on the point of resilience. And I'm sure being emotionally intelligent in the armed forces brings in a lot of resilience. So let's listen to Drivyan Des and Mr. Milind Kher. I would like to introduce Mr. Milind. Mr. Milind is an emotionally intelligent specialist, NLP practitioner, and an ICF certified life coach. He works with the human mind and human relationships to enable personal and professional excellence. He comes with over 3 decades of experience, of which 17 years is hardcore FMCG sales in ITC Limited. In social marketing, he has independently set up and operated 50 wholesale dealers. He has worked extensively with brands like Classic and Goldflake and has been an integral part of successful brand launches in different geographies. He has played an important role in supporting the trade marketing systems and has cascaded this to managers and executives alike. He played a pivotal role in the launch of ITC Foods in key cities in the Western region. He has held senior positions in HR in the jewelry and education sector. From the past 6 years, he is the CEO of Hospitality Quorum, which does training with different sectors and whose flagship product is behavioral assessments using the extended disk platform. Over to you, Mr. Milind.
Thank you. A very good afternoon to everybody. And I've always had a tremendous admiration for the armed forces, whether we talk of leadership, bonding, teamwork. The armed forces have been outstanding and played a sterling job. So I'm really very happy to introduce to you Commander Drivyan Des. So a few words about him. I had to really compress this because it would have gone into pages. Okay, he's a veteran with 22 years of enabling teams in the armed forces. And this is followed by 7 years of enabling business teams and unleashing business leaders. In the military, he has donned many hats and leadership roles. As an armed forces assessor, he has an experience of having screened 10,000 plus candidates and detailed assessment of 2,800 plus potential candidates for leadership qualities for armed forces officers cadre selection. During this period, he assessed over 300 plus teams for leadership potential. Commander Drivyan Des launched his own leadership and OD consulting venture in 2013 called Inner Legend. Since then, he has headed a business and has partnered successfully with business owners, C-suite executives, core teams in transforming organizational performances. He's a credentialed coach with an ICF PCC and an EMCC SP. He's an alumnus of Business Management School IIMA. He's certified in group dynamics and assessment from DRDO, DIPR, Gestalt Therapy, MIT's certified master's degree in psychology and counseling, certified ontological leadership practitioner, master NLP practitioner. So that at a glance is what Drivyan Des is all about. And I'm about to put the first question to him. And Drivyan, the most obvious question that I can put is, why do you think EI has become important for the armed forces?
Thanks, Milind. Thanks for for those kind words. And yeah, this question, as you say it, why has it become even more important for the armed forces? Straight away triggers whether it was not as important in the armed forces for me as a question. So I would say that armed forces, considering the fact that EI has been around for some time as a terminology that is used in the civil street, and it's not so much used in the armed forces as much, it's not so popular there. But my understanding, after having spent a lot of time studying about these things and having been in the armed forces, that fundamentally armed forces is extremely high on emotional quotient. I mean, I would say that it has always been that way. Now, it may be a misnomer because for a lot of people, they feel that armed forces is about courage and the ability to endure and mental stamina, and it's a lot of physical, what should I say, skill sets that people bring, and in terms of very physically visible leadership skill sets and etc. etc. But I would say that is just a layer or a superficial layer of the armed forces. Actually, when you dig in a little more deeper, you will realize that armed forces essentially is not about brilliant individuals. Armed forces is about people coming in together as a team for a mission. And the mission keeps changing every now and then. And fundamentally, everybody has to be oriented towards the mission. And that cannot be possible without a high dose of emotional intelligence amongst all the team players. So if you ask me that what is the biggest fundamental building block of the armed forces in terms of an individual or an organization, I would say it is the emotional quotient and not anything else. It's not dynamism, it's not IQ, it is a whole lot of EQ. So that is my take. And why I say this is that I have been an assessor. Like you pointed out, that I have done a lot of assessments, particularly for the leadership skill sets. And we identify potential between the age of 18 to about 24 for people who are passing out after the 12th standard and after graduation and joining the armed forces and wanting to join the officers cadre. And oftentimes, you must be knowing that most of these are commissioned services for at least a minimum of 20 years. So once you take a candidate in, it's very unlikely that you can ask the candidate to leave after you've selected. It's a very crucial point where you cannot go wrong. You cannot make a mistake. And you have to be very, very sure about whom are you taking in as a potential candidate into the armed forces. Why I'm saying this is I'm trying to bring your attention to the fact that EI is used in a big way, even in the selection process, right in the beginning, as people are stepping into the armed forces, as a huge criteria. That is what I'm trying to bring into the bring to your attention. And they may not be using again the word emotional intelligence or emotional quotient very openly, but there are lots of other things, like not in the way Daniel Goleman has talked about emotional intelligence, like social skills and self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, motivation, etc., etc. I think these are the subparts that he uses. But armed forces uses its own well-researched aspects about emotional intelligence, which they have been researching since the world wars. And I have been trained by scientists, a bunch of them from DIPR, which is Defense Institute of Psychological Research, which is a subset of DRDO, for almost 6 months, and they grill you on these aspects of emotional intelligence, which they have. It's a very, very what should I say, superiorly coined and framed definitions and characteristics of emotional intelligence, which every assessor in the armed forces is like really, it's etched in their memories when they're going through this, when they're kind of recruiting people for the armed forces. I am saying that fundamentally, the process over there is that we depend on, if you see, there is effective intelligence, there is practical intelligence, there is emotional intelligence, there are a whole lot of intelligences out there, including, I think there are some people have created categories like social intelligence. Inside of social intelligence, there is linguistic intelligence and kinesthetic intelligence and spatial intelligence. There are a whole lot of kinds of intelligence. But fundamentally, what we were taught it by DIPR is that essentially at the root of it all, there is something called a basic intelligence. And that basic intelligence, that is the ability to do abstract thinking and to be able to analyze abstract things like patterns and recognizing those patterns, and all that is basic kind of intelligence that has to first fall in place for, adequately for somebody to be recognized as having emotional intelligence. That was how we were taught emotional intelligence in the armed forces by the scientists when we were becoming assessors. And once we have that in adequate amount, only then do the potential candidates, go into a whole lot of other series of tests which happen over the 5 days. So it is extremely essential to understand that first we identify basic intelligence. When they have enough amounts of it, then the second focus becomes emotional intelligence. And they don't call it emotional intelligence, but it is essentially the social skill sets, their adaptability to put yourself in another person's shoes, and basically the least of all, but I mean not the least of all, is the ability to be self-regulate and discipline, keep a person disciplined by themselves. These are all essential qualities. Again, if it is not there in adequate amounts, we do not consider looking at any other aspect. He may have an IQ of 150 or 160, or he may be a genius, but we let go those candidates who do not show up adequately, firstly in the basic intelligence, and then secondly in the emotional intelligence aspect. Only then do we consider further, the pathways towards selecting them for the armed forces. So that's why I feel that when you ask the question that how does it become even more relevant today or even more important, I think it has always been important.
Okay.
And it includes, emotional intelligence is included as a huge part of the process, right from taking people into the armed forces. That would be my huge roundabout answer about that question.
This is so powerful, and I mean these are such wonderful insights. There's a lot of learning in this. Okay, now today a very hot topic, at least in the corporate world, is what is the role of training, and how important is it? So I want to ask you, in the armed forces, how important is training in inculcating this culture of emotional intelligence? So how do you see the role?
I think it is huge. Actually, I don't know how much most of the people outside know about how armed forces people get trained. Since I have spent a lot of time now, almost close to a decade outside in the civil street and with corporates, and I've headed a business myself, I understand that training is something which cannot, in the corporate world, the amount of training that they do in the organizations is really minuscule in compared to what they do in the armed forces. So if just to give you an idea, a person who has spent about 2 decades in the armed forces, like right from when they join NDA or OTA or IMA or AFA or any of these places, and they spend 20 years in their career, a rough way to give you an idea is 10 years out of that would have been in training.
Wow.
10 years out of that. Awesome. So it's almost like 50% training. And I have come across talks, and I have read about articles where people, senior management people in the corporate world, have been taken to, like in Infosys, I think they have a massive training academy in Mysore somewhere. And I've heard they bring fighter pilots from the Air Force to give talks on decision making, for example. They forget that when a fighter pilot is taking a decision inside of a cockpit, inside a fighter, which is happening in split seconds, every activity is happening in split seconds, those fighter pilots are sitting in the cockpit after spending 10, 15 years of training. And it's that decision making does not happen in those mini microseconds just because they are fighter pilots. It's also the entire grooming and the training and the disciplining and the way they have understood the context of where, how they're performing in a particular environment. All that comes into play. So training is a huge part of inculcating emotional intelligence and improving the emotional quotient of armed forces people. It is there at all levels, even after you become a commissioned officer, and even when you're outside there in an operational place. Even in these operational places, there is still training going on side by side, even when they are in lay or whether they're on ships out there, it's going on side by side all the time. So it's a massive, huge part. Like there is a saying in the armed forces: the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. I mean, if you would have heard of this.
Oh, so, wow.
It's a simple thing. When the war comes, it comes only for that limited amount of time. But the preparation that you need to be at a peak performance in that limited exposure is years and years and years of training. So I would say it's a huge correlationship. Training has a huge correlationship in building up the emotional quotient of armed forces personnel.
Wow, fantastic. In fact, that answer was so comprehensive, Drivan, that it has sort of taken care of my next question, which was how would you divide time between learning and performance? And you have indicated very clearly that it's 50-50. Is there something else you would like to add to that, or should I go to the next question?
No, I would say that if you just to give you a context, if you see Usain Bolt, Bolt runs 100 meters in about 10 seconds.
Right.
And the world sees those 10 seconds. They don't see the 10, 15, 20 years of effort that has gone behind those 10 seconds of performance, which he comes up with in the Olympics. And I'm not talking about a 100 meters race. I'm not talking about a 100, 200 meters race. Even if you take a marathon runner for the Olympics, for that matter, the years and years of training that is going on behind it to come to that peak level of performance. I think that is the part which people don't see. It's like
Yeah.
in this conversation, people were talking about the tip of the iceberg. That is what we get to see, is a small glimpse of the glory days of that performer. And we generally don't notice what all sacrifices and what all training and all the efforts that has gone behind it. So that is somewhat akin to what happens in the armed forces when you see the leaders in the armed forces performing and executing and expressing themselves in leadership roles. And if you see an admiral, or if you see a general who's the commander-in-chief of entire command, you are actually seeing the final product of something which has taken years to build. So that is what I would compare training and performance to. The performance that you get to see is a very limited exposure in terms of time, as compared to the time that is gone in behind making that person expressing himself in leadership capacities that way. So it's a very highly skewed kind of a ratio, I would say, which is the truth in the armed forces.
Yeah, and in fact, people like Daniel Kahneman and other people have said that you require something like 10,000 hours of doing a particular thing to achieve mastery in that. So I think what you have spoken, brings that out so well.
Yes.
Which gets me to the next question. What is important when people move from the armed forces to civilian life? Because I think there's a huge cultural difference that happens, and there's a lot of adjustments that need to be made. So could you spend some time on this?
As you say this question, what comes to my mind is when I got trained in the armed forces, I was a very, a stubborn candidate or a stubborn trainee, not wanting to give up my freedom and not wanting to give up my identity, coming from the civil street and stepping into the academy for training. And I found that the seniors who were trying to kind of mold me into a certain fashion found it extremely difficult and challenging, because I was the most resilient in terms of not wanting to give up my identity of being free and a free-spirited person, and not wanting to take orders and wanting to think of my own, and etc., etc. It's exactly just the opposite when you leave the armed forces and step into the civil street. By that time, after 20, 25 years and 30 years, you have become such a regimented, very disciplined kind of a person. You think like a team, etc., etc. All that is happening. And suddenly when you step out into the civil street, you realize that it's a very, very different world out of there. Now, I'll tell you the way the armed forces trains people and the kind of exposure that people have all through the years, partly because of how they function in teams, and also the tremendous amount of training that has gone in how they understand an organization and how they relate to other people. That understanding is invaluable in terms of armed forces personnel becoming an asset to an organization in the civil street. You cannot actually buy that with money. You cannot replace it with any amounts of energy or time, because that is like years and decades of experience of being a certain way which you're bringing into an organization, into the corporate world. I feel it's a huge asset which a lot of people do not put value to. It is overlooked, saying that, yeah, okay, you were a leader there, and we have leaders over here, and so it's pretty much but it is not the same. I would say it is not the same. When a person from the armed forces is coming into an organization, the capacities and the capabilities that he's bringing into the organization most times goes unnoticed, because a lot of people outside do not understand the potential of an armed forces officer in leadership positions. They oftentimes, like I have felt that in the last 8-9 years, challenges wherein they say that you do not come from this background, or you don't have the industry experience for this kind of leadership. And oftentimes you'll realize, like, for example, I'll tell you a simple example which can really put this into perspective. The Virgin Atlantic owner, the flamboyant Australian British guy,
Richard Branson.
Richard Branson.
Yeah, Richard Branson. Now, Richard Branson is a person who was dyslexic, and he had some learning disabilities when he was young. And he's a billionaire, and he owns multiple industries in different kinds of industries. But if you read his interview and if you see some of his videos, you'll realize that he does not understand a lot of things about finance. Like, he does not know what is cash. He does not know too well the cash flow statements and the profit and loss statements. He does not understand EBITDA. He does not understand what is, different kinds of how money flows, etc. But he's a billionaire, and he's running his businesses successfully purely because he's very, very high on emotional intelligence. Yeah. And he's a team person, and people love him in his organization. He's not financially extremely smart. He has people to do that for him. But he gives a talk somewhere where he says that one of his CFOs came and explained it to him that, this is net profit, and what is the difference between net profit and overall profit. And he explained it like throwing a fishing net, and all the money, all the fish that gets stuck inside the net, that is net profit. Explained it to Richard Branson like that, and he understood. But the point is, what I'm trying to bring my attention over here to is that Richard Branson, a billionaire in the world, successful, does not understand what is net profit as a word, whereas that is not the true way corporate world is. Corporate world feels that if you have been a leader in the armed forces, you do not have the industry experience of being a leader in an IT world, or in a pharmaceutical world, or in a automobile world. I believe that is a very wrong understanding of what leadership is. Yeah. Leadership is about being able to activate teams and organizations and taking them down a certain vision. And that capacity, I think most armed forces leaders have, which is tremendously undervalued or not understood in the right perspective. When corporate people assess, can I take this person from the armed forces as a leader in my organization, in the corporate world, in the space? That is a huge misnomer. That's a huge misunderstanding. That is what I feel. So what value does an armed forces person bring when he's stepping out in the civil street? Tremendous. But unfortunately, there is no way to measure it in the right with the right kind of measuring scales. That is all I can say. In terms of leadership, yes, fantastic, but it is not understood. So that is a part. But their ability to adapt and the ability to kind of take on any kind of, most people think that they're good for security kind of jobs. Make them the security leader of an organization, like big companies like Reliance, or etc. But that's not true. They're capable of tons of things. Like, I have been essentially a pilot. I've flown 3 different types of aircraft, but I've commanded a ship, and I have given talks on India Gate to the Chief Minister of of Maharashtra when they were fly past. So I have organized events. I have organized massive parties. I've handled VVIPs. I've handled VIP, and there are a whole lot of activities. We have taken over the mess and run mess funds. We have taken over so many other kinds of, financial funds and run them. So it's not just one thing that an armed forces person does through their career, which is like he's an artillery person, so he knows only about this, or he's a naval executive, so he knows only about ships. He's a pilot, so he knows only about aircraft. No, I don't think that's correct about armed forces people. Armed forces people, every year they change their roles and they change their portfolios for an overall growth as they keep going up in the services, and they get a very rounded kind of a perspective about most things. So therefore, an armed forces person, when you look at as a potential leader in the corporate world, even though he may not have industry experience, I would bet my money on him any day as compared to anybody from the industry with lesser experience, because what kind of leadership capacity he brings into that space, it's priceless, really.
I totally agree. Dhrivan, to conclude, what kind of message would you like to leave our audience with? Because this is something we would really look forward to, and we would imbibe and internalize.
Well, actually, I would, if there are any questions which anybody has, then yes, I would like to take on the questions. In terms of, if there are no questions, then yes. A message I would give is that I feel that a lot of things about armed forces is misunderstood, both in terms of the impression people have about who armed forces people are and their capabilities and their abilities in how they can express themselves and the kind of roles that they can take on in the civil street. I feel that if you actually bracket them as armed forces people and not go deeper and understand the processes that they're taken through over their journey through their 2 decades or 3 decades, it would be really a very what should I say, a loss for whoever is making that assessment as an organization or as a team of people. I would think that armed forces people are extremely high on emotional intelligence. Their emotional quotient is very high because they function as teams. They are people who are actually trained and tuned and molded in ways wherein they are willing to sacrifice their lives for their country. I mean, how many people out there in the civil street are going to be capable of laying down their lives for a cause? I got a postmate in the armed forces who's actually many years ago, 23 years ago, he actually put himself ahead of his juniors to stop, to kind of come in between a grenade blast and his juniors getting affected by it. And he actually threw himself on top of the grenade, and he's still got splinters in his lungs and his heart until today. He lost his functionality in the right hand, and he actually picked up his left hand all over again and started writing in his left hand. But I'm saying, how many leaders in this corporate space is capable of actually throwing themselves in like that in that fashion for their teams, for their subordinates, for their peers, for the organization? I think these things are not understood out in the civil street. So when I, as a person, come into a corporate organization and say that I am willing to lay down my life for a cause which I believe in, and that is totally misunderstood. Corporate people don't get it. I've tried this sentence out a couple of times in the corporate space. They don't get it. They say, come on. I mean, you might be saying this because it seems very fashionable for you, but they simply don't get that we are people who are willing to lay down our life for causes, and it can be tapped actually. If you're all talking about emotional intelligence for the last 1.5 days, you simply need to understand that armed forces people need to be tapped for the kind of potential.
Absolutely.
And if you understand where they come from, if you don't get the context from which they are groomed and they're brought into this world after 20 years, what they can give you, then that's actually your loss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dhrivan, I have a question. Since you were in selection boards and things like that, the most controversial movie just now, it has got released, and with Gunjan being there, and then armed forces giving that though they weren't sensitive for the selections and things like that, but showcasing some of the things. I would like to really hear from you in the SSB selections. How did you include women? And I know now flying officers also got included and things like that. So what is your, please give us the inside story for us too, for the civilians.
I'm quite in a position to give that inside story because my wife was the first batch of Air Force officers commissioned in the Armed Forces.
Absolutely. Yes.
In 1992, my wife commissioned in the Armed Forces, and she was commissioned by the President of the country, the very first batch. And in fact, she came in before Gunjan Sharma. And then I have flown, my flying training has happened with the first batch of lady pilots who actually trained in the Air Force. And very honestly, I think that the movie has done what it did to show, I don't know whether it is for TRP ratings or to kind of make it like this is typically, I mean, the director, he's very fond of making all these emotional, twisting it very emotionally the way he wants to. But if you ask me, I feel I have spoken to my wife and I've spoken to her postmates and I've spoken to a whole lot of other lady officers from the armed forces to get a true perspective on this. And I don't think most armed forces ladies have been treated like the way Gunjan Sharma has been. They have portrayed Gunjan Sharma to be. Honestly, I don't know. Men have this mentality right from if you've been groomed up well that when a lady comes into a room, you actually, if you're sitting and there's no place to sit, you get up and you give that lady a place to sit. I mean, that is typically how you would. This is how we are groomed in Indian society, and any decent grooming across the world. This is how men would behave. The way they showed how men behave in the armed forces, typically in the Air Force, for a lady officer, a lady pilot who's supposed to be good and a topper in her. I don't believe all those things which were shown were true. It may have been personality clashes. There can be one person in the armed forces or two people in the armed forces who have some kind of a mindset towards, this is a man's job and how is a woman over here suddenly out of the blue, and that kind of a thought process. And maybe it's a very personal equation the lady may have had with one or two people, but to kind of show the entire Air Force in behaving in that fashion, I think that was completely off.
Brilliant take.
That happens. I feel my wife was very proud having served. She was very, very well treated. Even today, my wife, by the way, is just being diagnosed for COVID, and she's COVID positive, and she's in the hospital right now. And a few days ago, the commandant of the command hospital, who was posted here, he touched base with my wife after almost 20 years because he remembered her when he came in as the commandant, and he said, you know what, you used to serve with me, and why don't you come home for dinner? And this is AVM, Air Vice Marshal calling us home for dinner. And he touched base after 20 years. You tell me how many organizations do this, and this is first course batch women officers. They were a prized possession in the armed forces, and not like how they showed in Gunjan.
Gunjan. Thank you for that take, because I wanted that insight perspective, because that's what I don't wanted anyone to go with the picture at all. Thank you so much, Drivyan. Thank you for joining us. Can I have the slide, please? Thank you, and thank you for
Thanks for a wonderful session, Drivyan. Any further questions, we'll have them sent to you, because a lot of people.
Thank you to my friend Muni, who has recommended you, because he's right now in the naval. This one, he's the Captain Ramchandra Muni, and I think he should not be able to attend. So he asked him, "Well, can you refer me someone?" And he referred your name. He told you are the best person to be there, and you did really be the best person for us to talk about all the things about EI in armed forces.
I must say that half an hour is very short.
I absolutely understand that. We will have a masterclass from you to understand more than you understand.
Absolutely, much needed. Yeah,
definitely. It's a small
because as I speak, there's so many thoughts that come to my mind, and I feel, should I share this or should I share that? I'm
sure. We will do a thorough class with you, definitely.
Thank you.
A small token of appreciation, Drivyan, from Emotional Ethics and MEQ Academy, for sharing your insights and being a speaker in our EI Summit. Thank you so much. We have planted. Yeah, go ahead, please, for the next slide, please. Thank you, Milinji, once again. Thank you so much for being great moderator for us. Thank you, Drivyan. We have planted a plant in the state of Karnataka, since you're from here. So I wanted it to be planted over here. And our sponsor, GAP Digital Solutions, have sponsored this plant, and we have put it in Karnataka. Milinji, for you, we have planted it in Uttarakhand. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, GAP Digital Solutions. Thank you, Drivyan.